Hi, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Today, I have the pleasure to have Lisa with me. She is product at Datastrato and a DataOps lead at CDF. I met her a while ago at the Data Day Texas, and I'm super thrilled to talk to you, Lisa, today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Karl. I'm really excited. I know that you've had some incredible guests on this podcast, so I'm happy to be among their ranks.
Great. So let's start a bit with you. You've worn a lot of hats: data analyst, software engineer, open source contributor. What is one unexpected lesson you've learned along the way doing so many things in the data world?
I think that a lot of the same organizations deal with similar problems, despite it being different fields, but the actual nature of those problems have to do with the same domains. Like it's always around this idea of not necessarily scale, but access. And I think that's something that we're reaching a lot in terms of the data engineering world right now is thinking, how do we just make this data accessible and how do we actually get people to access this data? And it doesn't matter which system, doesn't matter which cloud provider you're on, it doesn't matter, what actual data you're working with. It seems like that's a reoccurring problem everywhere.
You've jumped right into the matter of things. I was just interested in understanding. Just allow me to take a step back, right? So you organize data meetups, hackathons, tech communities. How do you stumble upon this problem of data, metadata, and operations before we go into the details? Like this is a particular subset of the tech world, which is a particular subset of the data space. How did you come to this data operations space?
So I think that for me, a lot of it came into this idea of, again, access, right? But also interoperability. And I came from initially a non-tech background. And so I do pride myself a lot on my soft skills sometimes. And I feel like communication is such a hard issue between teams. And we're noticing a lot of these different data silos, whether or not it's getting access to data across all these different departments, but also, the top-down views of getting a DevOps team to communicate with a data team, etc. So I've been with some really great organizations that have done it really well. And I've been with some organizations that did not do it that well. And for me, I really get frustrated when things are not efficient. And so if I know one person knows something over here and another person knows something over here, and they should totally be talking because they would make their lives easier, then why aren't they talking? That's something that is a problem that I'm really keen to help make a little bit easier. And I think metadata is kind of the way to do that, right? It's this common language. It's useful. You can build like event trigger systems off it. And so that's kind of where it came from, was just figuring out why aren't these two talking together and how can we fix that?
I think the greatest people in data came from a non-tech standard computer science background and found some sort of a weird connection to it, and connecting basically on the communication side and figuring out that metadata is the underlying thing that is often missing is a very interesting insight. You talk a lot about metadata and data catalogs. Why do so many companies still get this completely wrong?
That the heart is there, but generally speaking, a catalog is a very broad thing to enact in your organization, right? And I think that depending on who's actually pushing for the catalog, you'll have completely different results. So let's say if it's a business team that wants to better define the data in terms of an operational and functional level, they're going to have a very different outcome in terms of what catalogs they actually look at, what different types of uses they're going to have for their catalog, and the types of features that catalog might have. Whereas a really deep infrastructure team is also going to have a completely different idea of what a catalog is, and then also what kind of catalog they're looking for. They're probably looking more at, some of the actual technical aspects of the catalog, how are the query engines interacting with it, what type of metadata is available. And they probably don't even care about some of the business glossary definitions too. But a catalog by definition should be able to encompass both in some sort of way. Or if you're going to have two separate catalogs, you want to make sure that they're both, interoperable, at least at that basic level, and tightly coupled in that way. But generally speaking, they're not. And so traditionally, we've had a lot of this cataloging come in from different domains of the business that were more concerned about definition and not necessarily in terms of interoperability. And now we're getting this new wave of catalogs that are around interoperability, but maybe are also missing some of the business definitions as well. And so we'll see how that kind of pans out.
Yeah, it is, because there's just such an overlay between the marketing terms, the technical terms, and actually getting the marketing people, the tech people and different segments of the tech people, the software engineers, data engineers, to talk together and understand them. So take for example, Apache Iceberg or Gravitino, data lakes in general. For those of us which we are kind of in the know, it seems like very cool tech. But do you feel like people actually understand how to use them properly or how to even think about them properly? And if not, why not?
I think one of the reasons why Iceberg is becoming so quickly adopted is because it's a little bit more intuitive to understand than other open table formats like maybe Hudi or Paimon. And I think it's because of the way that Iceberg uses the metadata itself and the fact that it builds so much on these formats that we are pretty well known with, like Parquet, et cetera. And so essentially, I do think that because it's so easy to use, that's why people are veering towards it. But that's from a data engineer's perspective. I think from a common user perspective, they just know that whatever is underneath that iceberg layer, they don't care. And even, a lot of folks might be querying iceberg tables, but not necessarily even know it. And that's probably why it's also so popular, is because it doesn't really change that much in terms of how the query engines actually interact with it. And because it's such a wide support in terms of different tooling, people can kind of switch over really seamlessly. But of course, I think that the open source community is a huge part of this. The more that an open source community grows, the more town halls you have, the more documentation you have, the easier it is for people to just jump on it. And oftentimes we'll see that the winner of different technologies, not saying that Iceberg isn't this, I think it's a really elegant solution, but generally speaking, it's not necessarily the most advanced technology that's the winner. It's the most accessible, the most easier to understand, the one that has the best community behind it. And that's what Iceberg kind of is. And I think Gravitino will get there as well. Generally speaking, they're both very different in terms of how they use metadata. And so with Gravitino, we're seeing a little bit more of like a technically deep tool. And so there's a lot more communication that has to go around it. And I think something like Polaris, you're going to see people pick up really quickly. It's like a iceberg catalog for Snowflake tables. So that seems really intuitive, but you also have this wider scope that you have to have with metadata where you're going, okay, well, what about Hudi? What about Paimon? What about all these other engines? What about, non-Snowflake tables? And how do I actually do real governance with it? And I think that level of complication has to be better communicated within the wider community for it to pick up a little bit more.
Right, because Gravitino is aiming to be kind of the metadata lake we all supposedly need, right? and so and as you mentioned, so it can be just on a Snowflake level, right? I mean, even if you consider the largest companies, even the largest Snowflake customers, I would venture to say that Snowflake is just a teeny part of their overall data footprint. What's the vision for Gravitino, and why should we care about it?
So Gravitino, people don't know who are listening at home, it's really a catalog of catalogs model. And essentially, we've taken this idea of a data catalog and converted it into what is essentially like an end-to-end metadata plane. So let's say that you have different relational stores, you have event streams, you have maybe even some machine learning models and unstructured data and file sets that you need to manage. What you'll find now is that there's a lot of individual catalogs that handle those specific domains. So you'll have like a schema registry, or you'll have like a JDBC catalog, you'll have your own Snowflake catalog or your own Iceberg catalog. But really, in order to have end-to-end governance, and this is from the data side and the AI side, you actually need to have a single plane, right? Where you can enforce all of your access controls, where you can have some sort of governance built in place. And so what Gravitino tries to do is not be the best catalog for every single one of those things, but to take the best of those catalogs, or at least the most supported catalogs, and create this interoperable layer between them. So we can ingest from other catalogs, which is really cool. And you can keep that flexibility.
The metagrid.
Yeah, it is
what Oli talks about.
Oli and I have talked a little bit about this, because the metagrid is like this idea of having an interconnected metadata, like almost layer, right? Like it's decentralized metadata. And to me, it almost feels like a little bit like a Web3 for metadata, if you were ever going to make such an analogy, right?
Makes sense.
But you still have to think about the tools that you'll use to enact that. And he might, not necessarily be happy that I'm prescribing Gravitino, but I think Gravitino is sort of a means to that sort of end, right? How can you take all these different tools, their catalogs, register their metadata in one place, and then actually enforce your policies there, make sure that all of your query engines are interacting with it, and then do all of your lifecycle management in kind of one layer. And that's really what Apache Gravitino is about. It's about the flexibility of a tool versus the rigidness of a tool and being prescriptive.
Right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and not every company has every conceivable problem or constellation. They would need something like Gravitino to solve most of their cataloging needs. Doesn't mean that that's the solution to everything, right? So everywhere. So thinking about data ops, what's one myth in data ops that people continue to believe, or that is out there and you think is not true? How would you, moving on to data ops, how would you advise people to think in way of modernizing or optimizing their data ops from the process level?
I think that a lot of folks in data engineering feel like they need to reinvent tools oftentimes. And I think a part of this is because when you're dealing with large scale solutions, you tend to veer towards similar solutions at the end. So something like orchestration is a really good example of this, where you might have had orchestrators for a really long time in sort of cloud computing systems. But then all of a sudden we needed to rebuild Airflow, for instance, or even a declarative system. And I think that part of this is a communication issue where a lot of these tools maybe existed in the DevOps world. And then because people didn't know how to use them in the data engineering world, they decided to just either rewrite their own, or they just weren't even aware that they existed. And so you don't need to keep writing new tools every single time. I think we're in like this like weird tool wave where every single 5 to 10 years, it's just this new set of new standards. And I think that data ops is really the antithesis of that, where you're thinking, what tools can I use already in my box that we're already supporting to fit new use cases, instead of constantly changing my stack around each time, because that's really punishing to my system and to my organization to be able to do that. Part of that has to do with vanity engineering, in my opinion, and just trying to always be kept up to date with the market. Generally speaking, I think part of it is also just lack of communication. So yeah.
And this is just with you when you say that you think the best companies with the best data teams. And I just was discussing with a colleague the other day, and a kind of a mid-wit trap meme came to my mind and said, look, if we're talking about data operations, for most, let's say medium-sized companies, smaller companies we see in Europe, if you know the mid-wit trap meme, right, where the kind of the epistemologically challenged and the super genius, they all agree, but for different reasons. And our solution was for the left side and right side of distribution. It's like both are saying it's just 3 engineers that solve tickets. Simple, right? And in the middle, you have the person saying, oh, we need a comprehensive ITO compliant service management framework with layered escalation paths, cross-functional handoff design, and KPI-aligned operational governance models to ensure optimal service reliability. And we're like, yeah, but still 3 people have to solve the tickets, right? And ties back to what you were saying with, then they come up with their own kind of reinvent the tooling to do so, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so much of this is like the fight for relevance too. But like you'll find that organizations can just run in circles all day if you really let them. And it's incredibly frustrating from an engineering team to have to deal with that. It's just like, just tell me what I need to do. Just tell me how it affects my day to day, instead of all this paperwork behind it and all these additional processes.
Oh, it's amazing. You have to see some consulting in action with that. And it's like discussing, saying, okay, we're going to do some, operations design strategy here. It's ultimately, it's like 3 items for a technical. So I have to discuss that. It's like a whole super complex discussion. But then talk to the engineers. It's like, oh, you got to configure these 3 items, and here's how the tooling is going to work. And yeah, they're like, oh, got it. Super easy. So no need for all that compliant, ITO compliant strategy thing. But I do understand where it comes from, right? Because you do have to have process. I mean, that I'm not disclaimer. I'm not saying it's just a fun meme. Anyway, yeah. But you were talking a lot about the changing of the stack, right? I listened to your data operations talk, and what do you think? Like, if you could redesign the modern data stack, or do things differently, what would you do differently?
I think the number one thing that I would really try and do is offload more to DevOps teams. Like, I think that's probably one of the biggest issues, is that at least in ML ops, I notice this, and I'm starting to notice this in data ops too. It's like when you're creating tools like Kubeflow and MLflow, which are amazing tools, by the way, I think that they met really like like big needs in the market. But when you create all these specialized tools, it becomes harder and harder for an external team to jump in and then to take over that work, right? How do I figure out the resource management around this? How do I actually figure out the IT layer? In that talk, I kind of talked about the different parts of the platform. You also have network down there. You also have your physical layers. And so you need to figure out a way to manage that. And your machine learning team's not going to manage that. Your data like engineering team's not going to manage that. And so can you create tooling in that case that you know that another team is proficient in, not because you enjoy that tooling, but because you know at the end of the day that you can hand it off to somebody else and they're proficient with that tooling. And that's
Right.
probably one of the hardest things.
Exactly. And especially if it has to be something that would survive over, that'd be like a stable path to go down to, and not just like a collection of workarounds, cobbled tools together.
Mm-hmm.
The DevOps approach is kind of the first principle thinking around it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of one of the things I love about DevOps is the philosophy of, how do we assess the tooling and how do we be very rigorous about what we take on and what's maintainable. I was just talking to Patrick during that day, actually, and he was mentioning that so many companies, including, the one that he was involved with, also still runs on Jenkins. Like Jenkins, I think a lot of people see as very old. And maybe irrelevant sometimes, but there's a lot of companies out there that still use Jenkins day in, day out. And you kind of need to optimize some of those tools for like machine learning workloads. Like, I don't think the answer is having another CI/CD tool that just runs parallel to it instead. And then you have to maintain both. That seems like a lot of work to me, right? That nobody really wants to do.
Do you want to get the European perspective on this? They would say, oh, this is in line with our new data strategy from 2019.
Yeah. And people just always want the latest and greatest, right? I think that they feel like they need to bring something new to the table to justify their own worth sometimes, because I think that we don't want to judge people by maintaining old stuff. It's a thankless job, and we don't want to see them reinvent old stuff. We want constantly new things coming in. And that's more of a psychology issue. That's probably in a past life that I would go into.
Right.
But, right. And I think that's a huge part of it, unfortunately.
Disclaimer, my comment was just an innocent, fun remark, especially in these times of Europe being under pressure right now from geopolitics. Definitely don't want to put more pressure on Europe. Yeah. Just let me put some firewood. Just one real quick.
We have a firewood intermission.
Well, let's leave that in. But then, now, so yeah, okay. DevOps first principles, proper process, and the tooling you shouldn't reinvent the wheel. Fast forward 5 years from now, what's something about data engineering that you think will feel obvious in hindsight?
I think it's HTAP or like HTAS architecture, like this hybrid architecture that I think Iceberg is kind of helping push along, of like, how do we actually bring together and merge transactional and analytical like architectures and workloads. I think that those two right now, especially like the Kafka ecosystem and maybe the batch ecosystems, are very separate right now. And we're doing a lot of redundant work there. One of the things that I see, at least DataOps kind of jumping into, and metadata, and of course the catalog and open table formats too, is really merging those two worlds so that you can have consistency between those two states, and really understanding, better how to do real-time analytics and then also your analytical workloads at the same time. I think Confluent did something really cool at the last current they announced, which is that they built an engine called Cora that backs their new feature called Tableflow, right? And it converts all of these Kafka topics into, or writes them to like these Iceberg tables, and then kind of you have these two parallel side-by-side worlds that can coexist. I think that there's some optimization issues with that. You're writing a ton of like really small Iceberg tables, and the compaction around that is probably going to be really tough. But I think the idea is right? Like, how do you convert these topics into an open table format that then anybody else can look at and you can govern, which is even more important too. How can you have some permanency there for us to plug into the other tools in our ecosystem? So that's something that I think will be really exciting to kind of see. And eventually we'll just have like one, maybe not one beautiful architecture, but one master architecture that we look at and go, oh yeah, these two used to be separate worlds at one point, right? And I think the same will also happen for unstructured and, structured data, et cetera. We're, having so many different pipelines right now and different architectures just to deal with different data formats and types, but that will eventually converge, in my opinion.
That's a brilliant insight. And I think this was the holy grail, right? With Snowflake Unistore and things like that, just trying to kind of merge operations analytics. But until we have actually an architecture that is the new way of having the confluence of those two things, operational and analytical data, that'll actually change a lot. I think that's a brilliant insight. But let's just switch gears and say, well, look, software is eating the world, AI is eating software, and other things. In terms of working with data, would you think that would create new problems we don't have now, that we're going to have to deal with data engineering, data operations in a way that some problems that didn't used to exist before, just because of the increased initial early generation AI that everyone is building right now?
So I'm actually going to quote Joe on this, and I can't remember where he said it. I think it was like a presentation he was giving or something like that. Shout out to Joe Reese, I guess. But he mentioned during a talk once that Spark was an amazing technology, but one of the punishing things about Spark was that it forgave poor data modeling. And I think that's going to be the case as we automate more systems and as we bring AI into the fold, which is that it will make things that are bad really forgiving, to the point where those really shitty things that happen will become such a problem that we won't know how to manage them once they come to a head. So one of those things that I think about is data access, right? Can you create really optimized access systems for your data, like through metadata and a catalog? Yes. Can you also just maybe at some point build some sort of AI agent that will crawl your data instead and go, hey, can you get this data for me? Can you retrieve it? At that point, you don't really have to worry about access, right? But at a certain point, you're going to have to do something with that data. And because you never at any point created a system where, there's a unified API or platform to be able to work off of, you're going to be really punished for that. We're obviously trying to get ahead of the problem with Apache Gravitino to create like a governed metadata layer for different, generative AI frameworks to be built off of. And we're trying to create something that's end to end. But generally speaking, the more tools that we'll have pop up in these small different ways to help make our lives easier, the equal risk there is there of it being punishing that we're forgiving something that maybe we should have handled and done right the first time, if that makes sense.
It makes absolute sense. And I think this is when people say, jobs are going to change, the things we do are going to change. Well, you're going to kind of have to move more onto the governance and the meta of things. That's why I think the whole theme of catalogs, meta catalogs, meta grids, all of those things are interesting for AI, not because there's like a direct application tomorrow where you can earn money on it, but because this is where the nature of the work is going to go, access, monitoring, because otherwise you would just have imagine the enterprise version of the AI slop just everywhere.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we forget oftentimes as even engineers is convenience trumps all. As long as something is more convenient than the alternative, we'll always kind of veer towards it. And that's something that rules kind of our daily lives and our consumers' habits too. But generally speaking, if you're an analyst, you're always going to take the path of least resistance to get your data and get the results that you want. You don't really care about the consequences of that, unfortunately.
Well, this is where kind of wearing my business hat, this is where also business processes play a part. And this is where this whole understanding of how what you're doing and all the technical complexities around it plays into the whole business kind of processes. Because some of my listeners are saying, wow, table formats and this and that, too much technical talk, we don't understand much. Well, this has some very real implications for how we're going to be designing your IT landscape pretty soon, for how your IT landscape is evolving, and also where your costs are going to be, right? Because you're not going to be writing things that AI can generate for you, but you're going to have to manage all of that. And you alluded to agents and doing just more with LLMs and MLOps in general. Well, that is not going to solve itself, right? And so it's an interesting intersection of where this becomes a topic for the management of the company to understand, okay, where are we having problems with our data process right now? That is not the tooling. It's not whether we do Databricks, Snowflake, or Fabric, but rather how our entire data lifecycle looks like. And you better hope that there's someone at the board level who at least has a grasp of what the engineers would be talking about. Because if you absolutely don't, then I don't think you would be able to secure a relevant spot in the business world 10 years from now.
Absolutely. And I think more than ever, the relevance of a CDO is so important. I think that a lot of folks assume that maybe under a chief AI officer or something like that, data will just kind of find its place underneath there. But it really is the prerequisite to successful or even manageable or workable AI, right? Anybody can train a machine learning model. It's training the machine learning model well. That's the issue. And I think that we're going to have those growing pains as companies try and push forward too fast without the proper hygiene in place and really lose just a ton of money. And I think one of the tough things too is that we might see a lot of C-suites or a lot of companies or investors at that point just write off AI for a little bit because they'll go, we sank all this money into it. We didn't get the results that we wanted. AI is the problem, instead of going, hey, maybe you just didn't get the data that you needed to train it well in place. You didn't just build the system that you needed to set it up for success. And we'll probably see a couple cycles of that, I imagine, come through.
Oh, Lisa, I'll be 40 soon. Let me tell you, we've seen this before. The first generation of this ML stuff, back there, back then the AI was kind of, it was both were used, right? But it was more on the machine learning stuff. We used to train models and do all of that. And you'd spin whole, data science teams and executive teams kind of felt that, yes, those are really super smart people that could do great stuff for the company, but they just never really, they just never really took off. It was a complete failure across the board in the entire industry, save for a few digital native big tech companies that got some of that right. But in the broader industry, I'm looking at the companies I know from the European perspective. Yes, you have examples that just absolutely underline the rule, and that's why I would say before GPT 3.5, AI was a topic that has been largely, that was not really the top of mind, right? It was really at the back of the line in terms of priorities. But now the hope is that we do more of it very soon, and the whole field is changing so much. But it's one thing you said is, okay, data is the underlying thing. I don't think that's understood, just widely understood yet. There's one component to it where people understand it as, oh, data quality has to be good. There's the other thinking saying, well, why should data quality be good? I'll just feed all the data into the system and it will figure out. We'll just have an agent that stores our data quality. It'll be good. But then the whole management of it is, I think, and the governance of it is much more of an ongoing job than as an initial setup that it's one and done. So it's changing so much. And I think also the CDO that you mentioned, the CDO is coming back. There was a time where the CDO was like, oh, the tune was short tenure. You come in as CDO, you're out in 18 months. But now the mandate has changed, I think. Now it's more like a different type of CDO job that was, let's say, even 3 or 4 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why the whole data and AI field is so exciting, because it kind of, it keeps shifting, but the same patterns return. If you listen to Cheap Stock, right, with AI engineering, where AI engineering is much more similar to software engineering than, let's say, our classical machine learning from the back of the old days, where you had like train models and deploy models. That's also changing, and it's super, super interesting. I think it's enabling everyone to do a great job.
Yeah, I really love that, because I think one of the things that we're having to shift in terms of data engineers is thinking about data not as this, we prep the data and it's high quality and it's perfect, and then we feed it into, an AI application. Instead, it's, a cyclical process now. It's this symbiotic relationship of, you feed the data into maybe a really strong foundational model. I think the stronger that foundational models become, the more forgiving it is for poor quality data, to the detriment of data quality. But then you also have to manage the context around that. You have to write new files, you have to feed it back in, you have to manage it. And that relationship is going to be so important, I think, moving forward in terms of how we handle that tooling in those processes. So I think you're right on the money in those insights.
Right. So yeah, so we talk about the past, the future. Let's do a couple of questions that are where we're interested to get your opinion on. Coming back to your own journey, because I think it's highly interesting to all of what you've accomplished. Is there a moment in your career when you thought, okay, I have no idea what I'm doing, but then it turned out great, or I think in your case, it continues to turn out great. What's your thought process behind that?
I think that, this is a quote that goes around, but in my opinion, the harder you work and the more you put yourself out there, the more that you're able to generate your own luck. And I think that makes sense, right? If you're sitting around doing nothing or you're not out in the community, it's really hard to run into opportunities or the right people. I was quite lucky in that the way that I got in touch with my current CEO, Jinping Du, and he was like, he used to be at Hortonworks and Cloudera, and he used to be a release manager on Hadoop. So really big data guy. But I gave a talk called Open Source Data Ops and ML Ops Strategies at the Linux Foundation Members Summit. And I wasn't even really supposed to be there. I just really wanted to go to the summit. It was kind of invite only because it's only for Linux Foundation members. And so, well, how do I get into the summit? I'll just apply to give a talk, right? Then they'll have to invite me if I'm speaking there. And then I went, okay, well, I was working another job at the time and I didn't want to pay to go. And so they had this really great diversity scholarship program where they said, okay, we'll pay for your flights and you're a speaker, so we'll cover your hotel and everything. And they do a really good job with those initiatives, I think, getting the right people in the right place. And in that talk, he just happened to be sitting there and he said, you know what, we really need somebody with this sort of landscape view of the ecosystem right now as a product person. They were very engineering driven at the time. And, I think that we still are in a lot of ways. And it just happened to be the right place at the right time. But generally speaking, that kind of ended up trailing into me moving to the Bay Area. And then all of these different things sort of popped up from it. And I think that's where so much really started. Coincidentally, at that same conference was where I met the continuous delivery guys who also got in on these data ops things. And I think that's where so much ended up changing. So, apply to give talks, even if you feel like you're a nobody. I think that's probably the biggest one. I think even getting to talk at Day-to-Day Texas was really humbling for me to be able to do. And I'm happy that people enjoyed, the talks that I gave from at least your perspective.
No, it was great and very well delivered. Actually, this was supposed to be a rapid fire run questions, but actually I have to comment on that because I have a similar experience with the data community. I started engaging with it just to learn more. But then it's kind of the more you contribute, the more you get out of it, and it's wonderful how much serendipity there is to it, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. If you don't engage with the community, if you don't talk with people, you don't learn their perspective, you don't listen to what they have to say, then you just don't have that experience and those opportunities and those learning moments, right? So
absolutely,
it really is like that.
Like, very quick last note on this is that nobody studied data in university. Like, that's not a degree. You don't just study data. There's different types of data that you might have worked with, and you might have studied statistics, but generally speaking, we all kind of came into this field from somewhere else. Like, we all found our way as stragglers. And I think that because the community is built up of these random people from all over, we support other people's journeys who are coming in, and we don't really get when somebody say as that they came from somewhere completely different. And I love that about the data community for sure.
Right, 100%. What's one terrible data habit that you still have? Or
I'll still occasionally plug things into like Google Sheets or Excel. I think that those are really quick and easy tools. That might be triggering for some folks because I know that there are some people who are really diehard about those tools. You know what I mean? Like they think that Excel is a great tool and Google Sheets are great tools, and they are. But one of the issues with using tooling like that is that it just kind of gets lost in the ether after you're done with it. And so it doesn't get part of that lifecycle management in terms of your assets unless you can plug it into like a
no
backend
comment on
or
that.
something.
As an executive, I can tell you that without Excel, I cannot make a shopping list. I'm absolutely glued to Excel. There's just no other tool for me. And
absolutely,
it's the best data analysis tool out there in the world, for sure.
Yeah. And there were some talks at Day-to-Day Texas that also, I definitely have been in and out when it comes to data modeling, at least when I was still like a data engineer, where I felt, you know what, if I don't need to model it, I won't. I just won't. And maybe that was probably a really bad habit that will make some people cringe.
Actually, yeah, no, I think, first of all, yes, you know, after the advent of data science, quote unquote, there's a lot of universities that you could do a master in data science, and there's all good stuff, but the basics. I took a university class in relational algebra 21 years ago. So it's like, and I was 20 years too late, right? From where people were actually doing new things in the field. So some of the fundamentals are really, really important. And but I'm a strong proponent that if, and especially if you're not from the field, but if you kind of stumbled into data, first of all, you can learn the basics and the fundamentals as good as anyone if you want to, and then have like one more perspective, whether you're coming from a medical field or from a technical field or from finance. There's all sorts of, or psychology, or social sciences, there's all sort of things, everything intersects with data and provides a different perspective.
Oh yeah, there's a ton of terrible statistics out there, but you need to pair the great statistics and the really strong data scientists with domain experts, in my opinion, to really gain the most value out of your insights.
Exactly. Yeah. What's the best career advice that you've ever received?
Ooh, it's funny. I've been able to pull out like direct quotes here and there, but I think in terms of career advice, I don't know if I have exact advice that I received that I felt like was really revelatory. I think a part of it is just like, you just have to keep putting yourself out there. Not all failures are failures, really, in my opinion. I think that every single time I've done something in my career that didn't end up having the result that I wanted, it still ended up paying dividends down the road in some way. Let's say I, put together a talk and it doesn't get accepted into a conference, or, whatever, it goes really poorly. I still learned a lot from just doing that. And it might come into relevance, 5-10 years down the road. Like these data ops talks I've been giving for a number of years now, but it really hasn't picked up traction until maybe this year, I would say. And you just slowly plug away at it, and you have to trust that just because it's not a success doesn't mean it's a failure.
So, I mean, apparently you have a lot of talents and a great skill at communication. If you weren't in data, what job or what field you'd be working in, you think?
So for me, I started out in neuropsychology, and I would probably go back. I'm a systems thinker. That's how I ended up in data engineering, is I love seeing how small pieces of things interact with each other and then create this larger cascading system. And the way that I initially got into this thinking was by studying hormones in the brain, and then how that affects behavior, and then how those behaviors and environments affect your biology. And so if there was money back in it and, it wasn't so stressful, then I probably would do it again. But I love what I do now, and I'm very thankful to be here for sure.
Exactly. So what's the nerdiest thing you've ever built in technology?
This is a bit weird. I tried to build in R, mind you, so not even in MATLAB or anything. And I used to be an R developer, but I tried to create like a computational remodel of a brain circuit in like rats. So this is called like the lordosis system. It was the first, fully like circular brain circuit that was, mapped out. And it was done by Donald Pfaff. Okay, that's super nerdy tangent, and it's like a reproductive behavior in rats, if anybody looks it up. But I tried to create that because there was a very niche field, I'm sure it's still going, called computational neuroendocrinology, where you're computationally modeling or doing bioinformatics on these like neuroscientific systems that have to do with hormones specifically. And that is like the most like deep nerdy thing that nobody gives a shit about that I've done.
And actually, R was back when I started with R back at the University of Economics and Business. But my only stuff in R that I've done there was some analysis of stocks and stuff. So there's just no.
It still is used quite a bit in finance. There's a conference out there, I think it's called like FinR or something like that, specifically for our users who are using finance. But yeah, I started off as an R developer, and that community is amazing if anybody's in the R community.
Right. So before we wrap up, can you say a few words of where people can find your work, or where they can hear at conferences, or learn more about the work that you do?
Yeah, I definitely would suggest Googling DataOps Initiative from the Continuous Delivery Foundation. We have a blog post that's out that, gives people a starting point of how to get involved. We have biweekly meetings. I would also say go to the Apache Gravitino GitHub repo. These are not like social links, by the way. I feel like I'm not that good with posting on LinkedIn and stuff, but you can definitely find me on LinkedIn too. But I try and be more involved with my projects, these couple of years instead of just trying to constantly do social media stuff. But you can certainly find me on LinkedIn if you want to get in touch with me. But other than that, I think that just following the initiatives and joining in and sharing your expertise is really where I would love to interact with folks.
Great. Thank you so much. Is there one final question that you have for me?
Yeah. So what is the most interesting, I guess, experience you've had as a podcaster, or like what is something that you learned that maybe you weren't expecting to?
Oh, podcasting for me was, first of all, I didn't think I would enjoy it that much. What I've learned is that the way to connect with people is to listen, and my listening skills sometimes are great, sometimes are not great. And podcasting helps me improve my listening skills, because in podcasting you really can select your guests and talk to people you really want to talk to and learn from. Would quote what Jepson mentioned, that even if your podcast has an audience of one, that's still good enough for me to proceed with the podcast. I'm hoping to improve it as I move from an absolute amateur to a moderate amateur.
I mean, it's been an awesome experience being here and getting to chat with you. I think that you've done a great job. And I can tell just, from the questions that you've asked and your enthusiasm that I think you're really enjoying this. And I think that this is something that we'll see past its second season into like season 14, episode 30, running for 10 years and,
already had 5 presidents on the podcast and just too tired of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I think, you know what? The interesting part is also humor, right? Because you get to talk to people in a way. The podcasting format I like is because that's why corporate podcasts don't work. Because you can have like a human opinion. You can't have that as a corporation. But it's a very interesting format where you learn stuff. That's why I also asked about your perspective, because there's always a story behind the person of how they came in touch with the technology, and there's always this angle to everyone. It's been a great experience talking to you, and thank you so much for your time, and thanks everyone. Cheers.
Thanks everyone. See you.